Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. G'day folks, and welcome to episode 68 of the podcast, recorded on the 18th of July 2024. Now, I've been working on this episode on and off since 2022, and for one reason or another, it always found its way back to the back burner. Now, initially, not all the records were available, and to be honest, there's one potentially very crucial one that will probably never be located, and the information that Laurie and I uncovered actually raised more questions than it answered. Now, this episode will also be a little different than others. While it is primarily going to be focusing on the life, service, and legacy of Lance Bombardier Leslie James Greenwood, it will also encompass the lives of 5 other men: Sidney Milne, Alan Keto, Geoffrey Plowman, Alexander Stevens, and William Mercer. Now, there is an adage often attributed to the First World War that describes war as long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Now, while that is true, it somewhat devalues just how horrific and terrifying that boredom can also be. And on the 16th of December 1943, in a rest camp in New Guinea during the Second World War, that adage would come true. Now, though, before I get started, I do want to remind you all to check out our website and web store. During my collaboration with History Guild, I actually unveiled on the podcast Facebook page a brand new patch. It is a unit patch for the Armoured Brigade, styled on the original, now disbanded, Australian 1st Armoured Brigade. It is now available for purchase on a web store, and a huge thank you to Karen, Linda, Mitch, and Paul for buying them already. Now, to get your own, head over to the podcast website, which is thedocnetwork.net, or a Ko-Fi store to pick one up. Though I do have to report that the actual morale patch has now currently sold out. I'm getting more in, but make sure you check on the website for more information and more ways you can support the podcast. That support helps keep this podcast going. And now with that out of the way, let's get started. Leslie James Thomas Greenwood was born on the 20th of June 1915 in Tarragolong, Victoria, the second of 4 children born to Leslie James and Mary Ann Greenwood. Virtually nothing is known about his early life prior to the 13th of March 1934, when he was working as a labourer when he joined the permanent military force as a gunner in the Royal Australian Artillery. His initial training when posting was in Victoria as part of the 2nd Heavy Brigade, Australian Garrison Artillery at Williamstown. While there, he was present for the arrival of the Duke of Gloucester, Prince Henry, during his visit to Australia and New Zealand in October, where the 2nd Heavy Brigade lined part of the parade route and served as the honour guard for a visiting American warship in the following month. He would be sent to Darwin as part of the 9th Heavy Battery on the 18th of July 1935, and it was with the 9th Heavy Battery where in 1937 he was promoted to Lance Bombardier. 1938 would see him transferred to the 2nd Military District in New South Wales and be assigned to the 1st Heavy Brigade in North Sydney under the command of Major Gwynedd Purvis Wyn Aubrey Meredith, as in the commander of the 7th Heavy Brigade during the Emu War, and as covered in episodes 20 to 22 of Season 2. Signing on for another 3 years at the completion of his initial recruitment period in 1939, Greenwood would return to Darwin as part of Darwin Mobile Force, and then was assigned as part of the 1st Heavy Brigade assigned to Darwin. In September 1940, Greenwood was taken on strength with the Darwin Battery, and in October that year, he began transfer to A Field Battery in Sydney, the longest continuously serving artillery battery in Australia, having been raised back in 1871, though by 1940, it was serving as a depot battery for the School of Artillery at Holsworthy Barracks. On the 5th of July 1941, Gunner Greenwood was attached to Wren Force as part of the 2nd 1st Australian Medium Regiment, and after a short period of pre-embarkation leave, was sent to Nauru aboard the troop ship and armoured cruiser Westralia. In early December 1940, 2 German commerce raiders sank 5 ships loading phosphate around Nauru, and these attacks seriously disrupted the phosphate supplies which were needed in Australia and New Zealand for fertilizer, but more importantly for the manufacture of explosives. In response, the Australian Army dispatched a force of 50 men and 2 18-pounder guns, codenamed Wren Force, to attempt to dissuade any further German interest. This would be the first of 5 so-called Bird Force units deployed to strategically important islands around Australia: Nauru, Ocean Island, Rabaul, Ambon, and Timor to serve as early warning and interdiction forces, firstly for German and then following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese thrust into the South Pacific to defend strategically important resources such as airfields. While he was in Nauru on the 18th of August 1941, Greenwood was charged with the conduct and the prejudice of good order and military discipline and fined 60 shillings and confined to barracks for 14 days. The following month, he would again be court-martialed for deserting his post while on guard duty and fined 100 shillings. For those of post-decimal currencies adjusted for inflation, 60 shillings is $288.19 and 100 shillings equates to about $480.32 in 2023 money. Now, this may not seem a lot in the grand scheme of things, but Australian soldiers during the Second World War were some of the highest paid, being paid 5 shillings a day while in Australia, and it was increased to 7 shillings when deployed. Greenwood would return to Northern Command on the 12th of March 1942 and would continue south to Eastern Command on the 20th to perform part of the 19th Field Regiment. April would see Greenwood AWL for a day, which saw him fined £1, and then surprisingly promoted to Lance Bombardier again, then Acting Bombardier, to undergo additional training. At the end of August would see Greenwood both AWL, then sent to hospital as a result of riding pillion on a motorcycle without permission, which somehow resulted in him injuring his leg. And if you, like me, didn't know what riding pillion is, it's the actual term for someone riding passenger on a motorcycle. While he would rejoin the 19th Field Regiment, a laceration to his leg would see him once more in hospital, and on the 1st of September, 8 days later, he would return to the regiment, but was reverted in rank back to gunner. For most of the start of September, Greenwood would be in and out of hospital, mainly related to injuries to his right leg. A court of inquiry would then be convened to address his motorcycle adventure, which resulted in a punishment of 14 days confinement to barracks. And at the end of his confinement, Greenwood would return to the depot battery at the Army School of Artillery, Field, Medium, and Survey. While there, he was qualified as a gun layer, which means he was responsible for aiming an artillery piece against a surface or air target. Greenwood would stay in the depot for the remainder of 1942 and most of 1943, but in that time, in November 42, he would be charged with 2 counts of drunkenness and being AWL for a day. December would see him hospitalized for 3 days for lacerations and a head injury. The new year saw Greenwood granted 6 days recreation leave in early February, and that was immediately followed with a conduct and the prejudice of good order and military discipline charge that saw him absent from tattoo roll call at the end of the month and awarded a week's confinement to barracks. Tattoo roll call has many names in different countries, but in the British and by extension the Australian Army, tattoo roll call was a bugle call made to recall soldiers to their barracks. It lasts 20 minutes and begins with the first post and ends with the last post. It symbolically informed the camp that all sentries had been set and it was time to get to sleep, and it is from this that the ceremonial last post is derived from. He would once again be in hospital in April with a broken nose from playing football, and while there he would go AWL once again from the 19th of April to the 17th of May, to the point where a court of inquiry was conveyed, and on the 14th of May he was declared a deserter. He surrendered to the authorities on the 17th and was detained until June, where he faced a district court-martial, where he was charged with intentionally attempting to permanently avoid military service. His defense was that he was visiting the girl of one of his buddies who was in New Guinea at the time, who was undergoing an operation and was ill. The board found him guilty and fined him £5. He would remain in detention until the 27th of July, where he rejoined the School of Artillery depot. It wouldn't take long for Greenwood to have another run-in with the authorities, when only after 5 days back at the depot, he'd be found leaving his post without being relieved and was awarded 14 days confinement to barracks. When carrying out that punishment, the 8th Field Battery would be redesignated and finally given a chance to serve overseas in a specialist role when it was redesignated the 2nd Mountain Battery. This move was brought on by the success of the 1st Mountain Battery in early 1943 and the realization that in order to fight in the rugged mountains of New Guinea, that the Ordnance Corps' quick-firing 25-pounder gun, the mainstay of the British Commonwealth armies employed by the Australian Artillery, was simply too bulky and cumbersome, and that the lighter guns like the American 75mm pack howitzer would be much more effective and useful in the mountains of New Guinea. On the 9th of August, Greenwood would be transferred to the 2nd Mountain Battery, and while there he'd be joined by Alexander Stevens, Bill Mercer, Alan Keto, Moose Milne, and Jeff Pullman. And from the book 100 Odd Mates, the story of the 2nd Mountain Battery, AIF, these men became fast mates and a prominent fixture of the battery. Despite being confined to barracks, Greenwood would also serve as a coach for small arms practice on the 31st of August. Gunner Alexander James Stevens was born on the 1st of February 1910 in Milverton, England, to Robert and Olive May Stevens. At the time of his enlistment in the Australian Military Force on the 12th of June 1941, he was living in Bondi Junction and working as a Grade 1 postal assistant and served as part of the Post Office Volunteer Corps. In July 1942, he married Joan Patricia Frances Stevens from Double Bay, and the couple would welcome a son the following July. In August 42, Stevens was appointed Specialist Group 2 Signaller, and on the 18th of September 1942, officially transferred to the Australian Imperial Force. He joined the 2nd Mountain Battery on the 9th of August 1943. Gunner William Henry Mercer was born on the 17th of March 1911 in Kingsford, New South Wales, to William Henry Mercer Sr. and Alice Mary Nee Christie, one of 5 children to the couple. At the time of his enlistment in the Australian Military Force on the 30th of January 1942, he had been working as a salesman and window dresser in Pyrmont with his wife Alice Frances Mercer and son Ron. In July 1942, Mercer would go AWL for a day and was admonished for it. He was then assigned to the 2nd Mountain Battery on the 9th of August 1943, but did not join the Australian Imperial Force until December that year. Lance Bombardier Alan Lewis Keto was born on the 7th of September 1920 in Cogra, New South Wales, one of 3 children to William and Annie Emily Clara Keto. He played 5 games for my grandmother's favourite rugby league club, the Western Suburbs Magpies, in their 1939 season, while working as an assistant wool appraiser, which was his profession when he enlisted in the Australian Military Forces on the 20th of May 1941, where interestingly he listed his mother's name as Nancy. In October 1942, he was appointed to Specialist Group 3 Gun Layer Light Greenwood, which was immediately followed by him going AWL on the 24th of October and fined 5 shillings. On the 10th of February 1943, Keto joined the Australian Imperial Force and was assigned to the 2nd Mountain Battery on the 9th of August 1943. Bombardier Sydney Albert Moose Milne was born on the 20th of January 1921 in Rozelle, New South Wales, to Sydney Albert Sr. and Florence Milne. At the time of his enlistment on the 7th of August 1939, he was working as a storeman in Rozelle. He was accepted into the School of Artillery Depot in February 1942, and it was at this time he married Jean Elizabeth Milne at St. Stephen's Church in Newtown. Not long after his wedding, he was appointed to Specialist Group 2 Signaller. On the 14th of September 1942, Moose would transfer to the Australian Imperial Force, and on the 14th of June 1943, he was granted additional recreational leave, returning in early July, where he would be taken on strength with the 2nd Mounted Battery. Gunner Jeffrey Frank Ploman was born on the 27th of June 1923 in Vaucluse, New South Wales, one of 3 sons to Leslie Godwin Tritton and Constance Smithhurst Plowman. All 3 sons would end up serving in the Second World War, with both of his brothers enlisting in the Royal Australian Air Force in 1941. Jeffrey is the youngest member of his group of gunners when he enlisted in the Australian Military Force on the 15th of October 1941 at the age of 18. When he was taken on strength with the School of Artillery, he was a junior accountancy clerk, and on the 10th of March 1942, Plowman was in hospital sick, which would have him at the 103rd Australian General Hospital until May, when he sufficiently recovered to allow him to return to duty. He transferred to the Australian Imperial Force on the 13th of October 1942, and the 4th of May 1943 would see him once again in hospital with an ear infection for 10 days. 13th of June 1943 saw him undergo signaller's training, which he passed on the 9th of August, when he was taken on strength with the 2nd Mounted Battery. All 6 men embarked aboard the Dutch troop ship, the SS Van Hoots, on the 11th of September 1943 from Brisbane, and then arrived in Port Moresby on the 19th of September, where the battery was marched into camp. While there, according to 100-odd mates, Greenwood shot a wallaby, which was put into a stew with wild buffalo meat from Darwin and was used to supplement the apparently unpalatable Southwest Pacific ration. The stark climate change that faced the men of the battery, unaccustomed to the steamy heat, made the conditions uncomfortable. And while in camp, Stevens and Milne attended the New Guinea Force School of Signals to attend the battery's signals refresher course. Training intensified in November 1943, which included hauling each of the 4 75mm howitzers along jungle tracks to get the crews used to manhandling the weapons without vehicle support, which is ironic considering the unit was designated as a mechanized force. And as quoted in 100-odd mates, quote, "Meanwhile, Jimmy Greenwood and Alan Keto had been obtaining dry fruits and whatever from Pope, and they produced their own brand of jungle juice. A half mug of this turned anyone troppo. Luckily, Major Bob caught wind of it, and it did have a strong bouquet, before somebody got alcohol poisoning and confiscated it," unquote. Apparently, neither man was punished for this, as there's no official reprimand in either of their service records. The training they were undertaking was to prepare them for their part in supporting of the Australian operations of the Huon Peninsula. The battery left for Lae by air on the 15th of November 1943 and subsequently supported operations in the Saddleberg area from the 17th to the 26th of November 1943. While there, they supported operations, and particularly on the morning of the 22nd of November, the battery was facing probing fire from opposing Japanese 75mm field guns. Greenwood, who was on number 1 gun, turned to Keto, who was assigned to number 2, and remarked, quote, "Alan, you wondered what you'd feel like under fire. How do you feel?" unquote. To which Keto yelled back, quote, "I'd rather be leaning against Brisbane bar drinking a bloody 4X, unquote. The day before, Stevens was evacuated the 2nd 11th Field Ambulance, only to arrive 5 days later. While in these positions around Saddleberg, the battery routinely came under fire from Japanese aircraft and artillery, which gave the crews plenty of incentive to reinforce their cover in between registering new targets. For the rest of November, the 2nd Mountain Battery provided gunfire support for the 2nd 32nd, 2nd 28th, and 2nd 43rd Battalions as they advanced on Saddleberg. On the 25th of November, Saddleberg mission finally fell to the Australian forces, and as a result, the commander of the 20th Infantry Brigade requested that the 2nd Mountain Battery be moved forward to continue to support the advance in a traditional fire support role. By the 8th of December, however, the advance had moved well beyond the range of the guns, and the Japanese were now retreating towards the north along the coast, much to the frustration of the battery, as it hadn't even been used in the capacity in which it had been trained, which was bringing gunfire into the mountains to provide supporting fire to the Allied forces in the interior of Papua and New Guinea. As the gun crews languished near Saddleberg as they trained and cleaned and repaired their equipment, rear echelon elements of the 2nd Mountain Battery advanced onto an abandoned Japanese camp at Katika and started to prepare it for use for the Australian forces. On the 15th of December, the gross of the 2nd Mountain Battery transferred to Katika and prepared to enjoy Christmas hampers that had been provided by the Australian Compass Fund. Though, to the dismay of the men as they opened their hampers filled with donated goods and treats, that the Christmas puddings were riddled with mould. If only that was the only bad thing to happen that week. At 5:40 p.m. on the 16th of December 1943, as quoted by the unit diary of the 2nd Mountain Battery, quote, "Explosion occurred in mess hut while men at mess. 6 killed and 7 wounded. Appears to have been caused by unexploded Jap grenade or shell," unquote. Those 6 men were Bombardier Sydney Albert Milne, Lance Bombardier Alan Lewis Keto, Lance Bombardier Leslie James Greenwood, Gunner Jeffrey Frank Plowman, Gunner Alexander James Stevens, and Gunner William Henry Mercer. Stevens was 33, Mercer was 32, Greenwood was 28, Keto was 23, Milne was 22, and Plowman was 20. The news of the death of these men rocked the 2nd Mountain Battery, especially for the men of the gun crews they were part of. Those who weren't in camp mourned their fallen brothers with a certain sense of survivor's guilt. They would all soon be buried side by side in the Koyora River Cemetery the following day, with the ceremony being conducted by Padre Seathray and Father Gallagher in what was recorded as a wet and dull day. Immediately following the funeral service, an investigation into what happened began. Simultaneously, the decision had been made to abandon the Katika camp, and the battery was informed to make preparations to move to a new location on Song River. The day after the explosion that killed Greenwood and the others, Major Stevenson, the commanding officer of the 2nd Mountain Battery, issued the following routine order. Quote, Serial 77. Unexploded bombs, shells, grenades, etc. Item 1. Any enemy equipment or unexploded bombs, shells, grenades, etc., whether our own or enemies, found by any member of this unit will be reported immediately to the battery office. Item 2. The location of the equipment, etc. will be marked and steps will immediately be taken for it to be rendered safe or disposed of, under the direction of an officer. If it is impossible, the area will be roped off and guarded until the destruction by engineers can be arranged. Item 3. Personnel forbidden to handle or interfere with such equipment, etc., except in the performance or instructions set up above. Personnel are warned that any wounds received by a member while handling such equipment otherwise than in the course of his duty will be considered a self-inflicted wound and will be charged and tried by court-martial. Any member so acting will also be held responsible for the death or injuries to other personnel caused by his actions. Item 4. It is the duty of all members to see the above instructions be strictly adhered to and to ensure that the lives of others are not endangered by the criminal folly of any individual. Number 5. All members are warned that the area Katika River Song is likely to contain many unexploded shells, grenades, and booby traps. Unquote. On the 21st of March 1944, the Court of Inquiry was convened to determine just what had happened, which resulted in the death of 6 men, which, considering that only 7 men of the 2nd Mountain Battery died during the course of the Second World War, the other man, Gunner Arthur John Singh, was killed in action, this was a considerable event. Unfortunately, the actual transcript of the Court of Inquiry has been lost to the ether, and despite the best efforts of the Research Centre staff of the Australian War Memorial, who tried quite valiantly to track down what had happened to it, I fear it has been gone forever, I was able to decipher from the unit diary and the service records that someone brought an unexploded Japanese munition, most likely a grenade or mortar bomb, into the mess hall at dinner time, and then somehow or some way that munition exploded. In 5 of the service records is the entry, quote, Court of Inquiry held 21st March 44 reported that soldier died of injury sustained at Katika on the 16th of December 1943 as a result of an explosion in the unit mess hut. Soldier was on duty at the time he sustained the said injuries. There is no negligence, misconduct, or failure to observe any act, order, or regulation in the part of the soldier, unquote. There was only one entry that was different. Quote, Court of Inquiry, reference 1/35/44, Court of Inquiry held 21st March 44, reported that NX 37837 Lance Bombardier Greenwood, LJ, died at Katika on the 16th of December 1943 as a result of injury sustained in consequence of an explosion in unit mess hut. Lance Bombardier Greenwood was on duty at the time he sustained the said injuries. The court is of the opinion that Lance Bombardier's carelessness was a contributory cause to his death. There is no misconduct or failure to observe any act, order, or regulation on the part of Lance Bombardier Greenwood, LJ, unquote. The legacy of unexploded ordnance is one that plagues the Pacific even 75 years after the end of the war, with tons of unexploded bombs, weapons, and ammunition lying dormant in the jungles and waterways in and around the Pacific Islands. And while efforts are made through the Australian-led Operation Render Safe every year to try and combat this, it is a case of the simple equation of time equals money equals lives. The sad reality is that very little has been invested into clearing up the former battlefields of the Pacific, to the point where most of these battlefields haven't even been visited yet by inspectors, and those that have lacked the appropriate funding to do anything with it. After the war, all 6 men were exhumed and their remains were reburied at the Leigh War Cemetery, each under an inscription chosen by their grieving families. Bombardier Sydney Albert Milne, his duty nobly done, forever remembered. Lance Bombardier Alan Louis Quito, sadly missed by his loving family of Liverpool, New South Wales. Lance Bombardier Leslie James Greenwood, duty nobly done, God's greatest gift, remembrance, rest in peace. Gunner Jeffrey Frank Plowman, beloved Jeff loiters with a backward smile until we overtake. Gunner Alexander James Stevens, his duty fearlessly and nobly done, forever remembered. And Gunner William Henry Mercer, always remembered by a loving wife, son Ron, and mother. While the stories of heroism and sacrifice are widely known in the annals of military history, these are often permeated by those of human error and tragedy. These 6 men whose lives were abruptly cut short by what was documented as a tragic accident and a single act of carelessness were simply doing their job. And while there may have been no glamorous sacrifice, it is important to remember the personal lives they led. 2 of these men, Milne and Stevens, were married and each had a son, and according to Greenwood's will, he was married to Margaret Irene Greenwood, though neither Laurie, the base record staff in 1944, nor I could find any trace or evidence of that marriage, or even if Margaret was alive. Despite this, all of them left a human-sized hole in the lives of those who knew and loved them. And as we close this chapter on the 2nd Mountain Battery, let us remember and honour all those who have served, acknowledging the full spectrum of their experiences, from the monotonous to the terrifying, and the records they themselves made. Articles for this episode are 100 Odd Mates, the story of the 2nd Mountain Battery, Australian Imperial Force. In Search of Safe Ground ERW in the Pacific by John Rodstead. Fact Sheets and Operation Render Safe from the Australian Department of Defence. The unit diaries of the Depot Battery of the Army School of Artillery, Field Medium and Survey, and the 2nd Mountain Battery. Nauru, the Pleasant Isle by the Naval Historical Society of Australia. From Cooperation to Conflict, How Australia Lost Control of its Northern Approaches, 1901 to 1941, by Mr. Tim Gillell from the Australian Army Journal in 2019. Report on the Committee into the Inquiry into Defence Awards, March 1994. A Short History of A-Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery from the Boer War Memorial website. Trove, the online newspaper archive from the National Library of Australia. The Service Records, the Virtual War Memorial of Australia entries, the Second World War nominal rolls, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission entries of Bombardier Sydney Albert Milne, Lance Bombardier Alan Louis Quito, Lance Bombardier Leslie James Greenwood, Gunner Jeffrey Frank Plowman, Gunner Alexander James Stevens, and Gunner William Henry Mercer. The court-martial transcript for Lance Bombardier Leslie James Greenwood, and the website of the Australian War Memorial. And in particular, a huge thank you to the Information Services team for the Herculean effort they made to try and find that Court of Inquiry record. I hope someday we do find it. I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, is made possible thanks to the generous support from each and every one of you, but especially to the members of our Armoured Emu Brigade community. Now, if you want to continue the conversation or suggest a topic for a future episode, you can do so on all our social media channels. At this point, the podcast is on everything under @IWODMJ. Links to everything are in the show description. If you want to join the Armoured Emu Brigade community, you can also do so on our Discord server. The invite link to that is on the episode description and on the podcast website, www.thedocnetwork.net. There you can find also show notes, transcripts, and photos of my various travels that are locating the myriad of memorials dotted around Australia. If you like what I do here on the podcast and want to directly support the work that I do, you can either buy the podcast a one-off coffee or support us on Patreon for exclusive podcasts, interviews, and giveaways. Each cent raised goes directly into improving the podcast, from digitization of service records and the purchasing of reference material to the distribution and licensing of each and every piece of content. But the best thing you can do is rate this episode on your platform of choice, leave a review, or share it with a friend. It's the easiest way to show your support and get the show into the ears of people who need to hear it. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast is mostly a one-man show, with me doing the writing, researching, recording, audio engineering, and directing, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not represent the opinions or views of any agency, entity, or organization. It is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 International License. And until next time, friends, catch you then. Bye.